But the point that David was making is that whilst inevitably when you use standards, there will be some impact perhaps on maximising the innovation that you potentially could deliver on a project. If you change the standard so that you can do something that isn't in the standard, then it's not a standard anymore. And it's worth, especially when people are making the argument that they should change a standard for an individual company's benefit, and then you've got 20 companies working on a project. Suddenly nothing is standardised. For those little hits for individual companies, there's a major gain for the project if everybody sticks to the standards. So I noticed when Ralph was introducing me, he nearly said I work at Studio Klaschka. Recently changed jobs. I decided I was fed up with running a small company by myself and didn't think I was very good at it, to be honest. So I've gone to work for SUMO Services now. I'm doing largely what I was previously doing at Studio Klaschka, which is making existing building BIMs from survey information, mostly point cloud. Very small amount about SUMO. At the moment, our built environment department is pretty little, about 10% of the company's turnover. We've got a name for below ground surveying, radar, archaeology, unexploded ordnance, that sort of thing. But watch this space because we're certainly expecting to be big in existing building survey. I'm also a member of the leadership team of BIM for SMEs, and I would encourage you, especially as Alan was explaining to me that there are now 4 BIM hubs in Ireland and Northern Ireland that are joining together with the hubs that the BIM 4s in the UK are very closely connected to. BIM for SMEs, well, it's pretty obvious what it does. We represent all of the small and medium-sized enterprises and look to help them with information about standards. More recently, we've started to play a lobbying role, and that relates very much. Just take a straw poll. How many of you would say that you're small? That is effectively under 10 or below 2 million turnover. Yeah. And medium? Actually, sorry, no, that's wrong, isn't it? That's micro, under 10, and I was micro. 1 to 10, under 2 million, that's micro. Small is 10 to 50, and under 10 million turnover, I believe. Yeah, just a few. And then I guess the rest of you are medium or large. Yeah. Probably most of you, BIM for SMEs are focused on. One of the things that we are fed up of hearing is that small and medium-sized companies don't know what they need, what they're doing, need to be helped. Yes, we need information, but we're also some of the most versatile and innovative of BIM users. BIM for SME showcase that through a number of things. Obviously, every year we run the BIM for SME Awards, and I'm sure that companies from Ireland would be welcome to submit for that. There are some excellent categories for that. We run a series of BIM clinics around the UK, which are effectively one-to-one, face-to-face meetings with start-up users. We're actually having a BIM clinic at Digital Construction Week in 2 weeks' time. And then we've got in the UK, the BIM for SME Build Live events, which are run with ASITE, who I think we'll hear from later. Something I would also really encourage you to download from our website is, in conjunction with ARUP, the BIM Maturity Measure tool. Now, this isn't specifically Level 2 focused, but it has a great deal of content which relates to Level 2. It's effectively a spreadsheet that you can download, and then it'll ask you questions about your company and give you an indication of where you need to look to improve things, what you should look at in terms of process. A really fantastic tool, that. And of course we're doing lots of other things. Do engage with BIM for SMEs, and I'm sure that there'll be connections made between the hubs over here and BIM for SMEs. It'd be great if we could perhaps do a clinic over here or something like that. So, the common data environment. Does anybody here think they've worked in a common data environment? Yeah, quite a lot. Now, this is interesting because, and I heard Ralph introducing the common data environment as simple, and I would say in many ways it is simple. It's a simple concept, but actually it's got layers of complexity in terms of both behaviour within the release of information and layers of complexity in the way that parties behave towards each other, which without, I would say, it isn't a common data environment. What can the bones of a common data environment be? And you're probably all thinking it's an extranet. I know there's some people in the front row who want me to say it's ProjectWise. ProjectWise, certainly a great tool to set up your common data environment. And all of these extranets that are out there will serve that purpose for you. Dropbox, if you behave the right way, could be a common data environment. And that is what the key to it is about the way that we interact with information, the release cycle of information, and that's what this diagram is. You'll find it in BS 1192 Part 1. There are 5 parts to BS 1192, which is sort of starting to sound quite confusing already, isn't it? I'll just very quickly run through what those are. 1 is standards, and that gives you information about naming of things. It talks about common data environment. A lot of people think common data environment is a Part 2 element, but it's not. And spatial standards as well. Part 2 is really about the process of commissioning and design of buildings. Part 3 is about the operation of buildings. Part 4 is really focused on COBE and a standardised delivery format for the operation of buildings. And Part 5, which is a relatively new one, is data security. And that, if you read that document, especially as a small company, it's really quite frightening because the implications of it are very significant. One of the things we're doing at BIM for SMEs is looking at putting together a common sense approach to BS 1192 Part 5 for small firms. So what isn't a common data environment? A lot of people think that it is just restricting you to working in a single piece of software. It's not that. The way that you work in a common data environment is defined by some of the front-end documents that are part of the PAS 1192 Part 2 process. And if I go on to the next page, yeah, you've probably all seen this diagram. You'll see the common data environment doesn't actually play a huge part in this. It sits in there, and that is effectively from concept design through to effectively the operational start of the building, so the handover of operation and maintenance. And you'll also see that these are the major COBE data drops. Those are for the client, and they're for client validation of design data. But you'll see that the common data environment overlaps 4 of those. The reason for that is that when you're designing and building a building, you have a lot more information exchanges, and this is one of the things that I think people can sometimes get confused about with the COBie data drops. COBie data drops are not exchanged between designers and other designers, or designers and contractors, or contractors and subcontractors. Those are things that happen in the common data environment, and all of that information is likely to be kept and handed over at handover. But the COBie data drops are effectively more refined drops of information which go to the client throughout the design and construction process to allow them to evaluate whether their requirements have been met by the design. So here again, if we this is the new Reba work stages. I don't know why Reba have pulled some sleight of hand with this, in that they were originally the CIC work stages, these are the new Reba work stages, and you'll see again the common data environment actually covers this section. And that's the period of the design and construction of the building, which, as you know, are when there are a very large number of information exchanges between different parties. This is important, and I think this is where it starts to get a bit more complicated than just this simple idea. How do we work within a common data environment? There are some really key documents that some of them are referred to in the 1192 suite of documents. Some of them are created because of the processes of the 1192 documents. And I'd encourage you, has everybody here read the CIC BIM protocol? Yeah. This is a really, really important document because what it does is it effectively sets the ground rules for the way that we're going to interact with each other. You'll notice I've not said BIM yet, really, but it's a rules of engagement for information exchange. And there are some really critical things, and as I'll say towards the end of the presentation, one of the things that a lot of parties in the UK are trying to wriggle out of are some of the obligations that make collaborative working work that are embodied in the CIC BIM protocol. There are a few things that we've got going for us in the UK, and that is that the insurance industry has started to engage with BIM. And there are a lot of insurance policies which relate to the use of BIM. Every one of them refers to the CIC BIM protocol. So if you're not using it, and you're not using the 1192 process, then you probably find that your insurers are going to have something to say about it. And I like that because it's a strong hand on the backside of those destandardisers. The employer's information requirements, which are, again, I'm sure you've all heard of, effectively define the way that we interact, and ultimately will generate the post-contract BIM execution plan. The BIM execution plan relates to the common data environment because it will contain the points and the types of information handovers that the team have agreed in the lead-in to the project, the planning of the project. And those are the exchanges of information that I'm talking about, the additional exchanges of information required to design the building that will happen in the context of the common data environment, your common data environment in that situation. So this, you'll see that CDE's got 4 bits to it, and this is where one of the situations that you run into in nearly every conversation about CDE, where people say, no, we can't actually do that. Work in progress, shared. Work in progress, never shared between parties. Yeah? That means I don't, if I'm working in a common data environment, and you ring me up and say, oh, could you send me a sketch of, I don't know, something, that isn't part of this agreed schedule of release of information. Well, actually, I shouldn't be doing that. There may be lots of these releases of information. This is where, because generally when I've had this conversation with people, the reason people say, well, we must share our work in progress because construction projects move too fast, or we can't define the exchange of information that we're trying to make. That's why we must have this sort of informal process for sharing information. Actually, the next thing that they do is they explain something very well defined, a very clear reason why they need information. Now, that should have been defined in the BIM execution plan. Yeah, there may be a large number of information exchanges, but one of the key principles of the common data environment is that the disciplines in their work in progress environment should always be using the previous shared issue of information to refer to, and does that sound, I've possibly not explained that very well, but does that sound complicated? Because it's something that people really, really struggle with in the UK, really, really struggle with. They're maybe addicted to faxing. I don't know what it is. I haven't had a fax machine for about 10 years. Anyway, and you'll see hovering underneath the shared area is the client shared area, and that's a special space for documents that are going specifically to the client. So it acknowledges that the client doesn't necessarily have to see everything that's shared between the different design and construction disciplines. Then you move on to the published documentation workspace, and that is basically what you build from. So there's no more in a common data. Who, as a design consultant, who likes the idea that the contractor shouldn't be building from some of your half-finished issued design drawings? That should never happen in a common data environment. And if you're following the BIM protocol, it's the contractor's problem, not the designer's problem. And then finally, archive. And the archive is effectively what is passed on to the client to begin the operational phase of things. So, I think I've possibly gone through a lot of these, but no, as I said, first one I've touched on. These are essential principles, and this is where I go back. The common data environment isn't that simple. Actually, it's quite simple, 15 slides. Work in progress is never shared. Information in the shared area has been checked. I mean, we all check our information before we send it out, don't we? You're never there on a Friday night at 8 o'clock when the main contractor's sent you an email at 4 o'clock demanding all sorts of stuff that you know he doesn't need for 6 weeks without checking it. It's one of the principles of the 1192 process is high quality checked information. The purpose of information release, of each information release in a CDE is defined, and the BIM protocol says it can only be used for what it's defined for. So if I issue a model for spatial areas, and then later I find the main contractor's building walls from it by scaling off the drawing, that's his problem. Yeah, this is what I mean about rules of engagement and collaborative. Any collaborative process, whether it's working in 2D or working in BIM, relies on these rules of engagement. The common data environment doesn't work without these principles being adhered to. And, of course, the last one, only information in the published area is built. This is quite important to me, I think. But what does checking mean? Have you? I'm sure you've never received a drawing or a model which is in completely the wrong place, ever. Is there anyone in the room who hasn't? No, of course not. Spatial position is Appendix A in BS 1192 Part 1. And anything that is issued that isn't in spatial position isn't valid, so it hasn't been issued. So if you've missed your deadline because it's not in the right place, well, that's tough. Completeness. Obviously, it must have been checked that if it's all the spaces that have been put in, if it's all the doors that have been numbered, if it's all the elements have been classified, whatever it is, whatever that drop of information says, it should have been checked for that. And accuracy is sort of the same thing, I guess. And also, it only contains, and this is a little bit difficult in that a lot of the BIM products that are out there don't really support this workflow, but it should only contain information that is defined in the information release schedule, or that would actually be the master information delivery plan if I'm going to talk in 1192 language. And that's quite difficult to do. I mean, think of how you would do that in your BIM package. Only issue the information when you've got all of these data-rich objects that manufacturers are supplying to you. If you've got a data drop that says you're issuing the doors with their external their structural dimensions and numbers, and that's it. How do you do that? Tricky. I think I know you can do it in your software. It is doable, but it's something we're not used to doing. I've talked quite a lot about rules of engagement, and this is really key to the success of common data environment. One thing that we run into on a regular basis in the UK and there's a really good thread, I think started by Chris Hallam on BIM Experts on LinkedIn, about what he refers to as BIM disclaimers, i.e., this model has been issued for information only, use at your own risk. If you're working under the BIM protocol, you are contractually obliged to share information, and you're contractually obliged to stand by the information in your data drops. So hence, it's important you've checked it. Information is only used for the purpose intended. I'd already touched on that. And this is a real sticking point in the UK. You talk to anybody who receives information, and I'm not going to say it's just the big main contractors who are the bad boys in this situation, but they're some of the worst offenders. They'll use a piece of model for anything that it suits them for, and that doesn't work. If you've signed the BIM protocol, and if you're working under 1192, every party working on a job should have signed the BIM protocol. Then you're on really sticky ground if you're using information for a purpose other than it has been issued for. And you can see from a designer's perspective or a specialist subcontractor's perspective, where we're submitting information to people, to a party building the building, it's absolutely critical that our information is only used for the purpose it was intended. I mean, who can't agree with that? You can see why it suits other parties to use it for reasons other than it was intended, and it may be okay. But if there's a problem under the BIM protocol, that problem lies with the party that has chosen to use the information. Another key tenet of successful, well, last thing that I said, it's a key element of collaborative, non-adversarial approach to using information. You know, that it's a sort of fair use policy in a sense. I think, you know, as your standards emerge here, I can't stress those last 2 points enough, because in the UK, that issue is being ducked being attempted to be ducked at every turn, and if you intend to try to use a contract form which is unfair to the providers of information, what is the likelihood that they're going to collaborate with each other? Slim to none, I would say. You know, the disclaimers come back in. So, this is just a few of the lessons that I've learnt over, and I guess I've been working in this environment really I've been involved with the team that made 1192 probably since 2005, something like that. The work in progress argument, people will always try to argue that work in progress must be shared, and I think that generally, in my experience, comes from a lack of adequate planning in the creation of your BIM execution plan. The BIM execution plan should be a very complicated plan of information release that identifies different parties' needs and the interactions between different groups in order to provide things when work needs to be provided. And in a BIM environment, it will mean that some people will have to do things earlier than they're used to doing them in a traditional workflow. It's when people start to get into the meat of oh, actually, we've got to change the way that we do things. We've got to change, you know, I might have to design something earlier so that the structural engineer can use it sooner. It's probably slightly unfair, that second line, but I've seen a lot of it. Contractors are addicted to the abuse of information, and they've got to stop doing it because they can't expect people to collaborate if they carry on. And equally, parties often revert to adversarial behaviour. What I would say is, you hear a lot about the good work that's going on in the UK. There's a pool of people who, on principle, are committed to the success of collaborative working. And you put them on a project working together, and they'll collaborate with each other, whether or not they're contractually obliged to do that. What the UK is struggling with at the moment is to come up with or to finish contract forms which embody collaborative work and standardisation of workflows in the wider construction sector, where perhaps people haven't done the sort of or been through the evangelical sort of process of learning BIM and loving it. So that's it. I'll sort of finish on that one. I think I've probably not got time for questions, but thank you. I hope that was useful and a little bit different.